and always good time to be together. We're running a couple of minutes late, but I think we about got everything hooked up, so it's about time to continue. We will be continuing our study on kind of the study of the great women of the Bible. We're going to continue with our women from the book of Genesis. Here's kind of our outline for the quarter. Basically going to spend the month of June looking at our women in Genesis. We've looked at Sarah, Hagar, and Keturah. We looked at last week. We're going to pick up this morning with Rebecca and Deborah, and then probably move into some of the ladies that are more connected with Isaac, which is kind of also connected with Abraham, but just kind of more Isaac from a improper way. So if you would, turn to Genesis chapter 22, and want to talk a little bit about Rebecca. Talk a little bit about Rebecca. What I'd like for you to keep in mind as we go through these ladies, keep in mind some of the characteristics that we find. There's some characteristics that are repeated with them, which I think is significant to notice. And also be thinking about some of the comparison and contrast between these ladies. They each do have their own personality that we find in Scripture, and it's just kind of interesting to notice some of their characteristics, some of the positives and negatives about them. So Rebecca is introduced to us in Genesis chapter 22, really starting in verse 19. So let's read these 5 verses. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men. They arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now, before we go forward, I want to just show a couple pictures. Beersheba is clear down in the south. So Beersheba is right down here, so it's clear down in the southern part, right on the top edge. It's kind of the northern edge of the Negev, but it's desert region there. And here's a picture of the ruins from Beersheba, and then you can see across there it is just a dry, arid region. And that is where Abraham is setting up. That's where home is for him currently. So verse 19 says that they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived there at Beersheba. Now verse 20. Now it came about after these things, it was told Abraham, saying, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. And then we have a list of those, Uz and Buz and Carmel. The last one, the 8th one, is Bethuel, and he becomes the father of Rebekah. So these 8, Milcah bore to Nahor, who is Abraham's brother. So also, by way of reminder, let me remind you of our family bush for Abraham. So we have Abraham, his 2 brothers, Nahor and Haran. Haran has 3 children, one of them being Lot, one of them being Milcah. Milcah then marries the brother Nahor, who they give birth to Bethel, who then gives birth to Rebekah. Then Rebekah is going to marry Isaac. So we talked about all of these connections that were there. So this is kind of where we are in our text at this time, is that Bethuel gives birth to, he and his wife give birth to Rebekah. And so Abraham is now going to go looking for him, basically. Go look for the family to kind of continue. If you would now turn over to chapter 24. So there's our introduction to Rebecca. The last phrase that's on the bottom of the page, we'll get to that. For some reason, my PowerPoint, I got confused and turned something on down there and couldn't get it turned off. So we'll get to that at the end of this discussion. But I want to just remind us of this account of finding Rebekah for Isaac. This account in Genesis 24 is again just amazing to me. So Abraham, remember, gets his servant that comes to him, and if you look in 24:4, says, "Go to my country and to my relatives and take a wife for my son Isaac." So let's look back at the map. So they are down at Beersheba, which is down in the south. The family lives all the way up at Haran, and then there's another city that is not on this map that is actually, if you go on up, kind of in this region up in here, Mesopotamia, up clear in the top north, is probably the city where they're actually going. It is off of this map. But when Abraham gets his servants together and he says, I want you to go to my country, to my relatives, that's where they're going. That is several hundred miles. I think it's 400-ish miles that they're going to travel to try to find a wife for Isaac. So verse 5, the servant said, suppose the woman is not willing to follow me to this land. Should I take your son back to the land where she came from? And Abraham said, beware that you do not take my son back there. Now, any ideas? What is Abraham's fear here? Why does he say, whatever you do, don't take Isaac back there?
Fall away from the teachings of God.
So I think one of these fears is that Isaac might get back there, fall in love, stay there, and never return home. And who knows what's going to happen with him there. So what else is going on in the mind of Abraham? Why does he need Isaac back in this region and not way up north in Mesopotamia? I mean, who cares if he goes back up there and lives? What has got to happen? Isaac's got to carry on the lineage, right? Matter of fact, that was the promise that God told Abraham. Your descendants are going to inherit this land. So Abraham cannot take a chance on Isaac going up there. Besides, did you see the countryside when we looked at that picture around Beersheba? So it's kind of like me living in Amarillo, right? Desert land everywhere. So I come to Durant. I fall in love with the most beautiful woman in the world, my wife, obviously. We get married. Do you think I want to go back to Amarillo, to that desert region? No way. I want to stay. Lake Texoma's here. The hun's good. The fishing's good. You know, it's beautiful here. I think maybe that was part of Abraham's fear. I don't want Isaac going up there in the mountain region where it's pretty and where there's trees. I need for the woman to come down here. So at any rate, that's kind of the deal as Abraham sends his servants up there. So they go to the city of Nahor, which again is up in the very top region of Mesopotamia. Verse 15 of chapter 24, the servant goes, and you remember he gets kind of close and he makes this kind of deal with God, you know, look, I'm going to get here and this woman needs to come out and I'm going to ask for a drink and then she needs to go ahead and water my camels as well. So he makes almost a situation that's almost impossible. I mean, you think, how is that ever going to really happen? But the guy makes this deal with God, and sure enough, that's exactly what happens as she comes out. Not only does she give him a drink, but she volunteers to water his camels as well. And he says, this is obviously of God, because this should not have happened, but it did. And so then he will take Rebekah home. I want to read a couple other verses. In chapter 24, look at verse 15. Before he had finished speaking, so he's making this deal with God. Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor, came out with a jar on her shoulder. The woman was very beautiful. A virgin, no man had relations with her. She went out of the spring and filled the jar and then came back up. And of course, that's then when the servant said, would you give me a drink? She said, sure. And then verse 19, I'll also water your camels. I'll draw for your camels as well, until they had finished drinking. Let's see, go down to verse 33. They go back into the home. When the food was set before him to eat, so this is Abraham's servant, he said, I will not eat with you until I've told you my business. So he made this deal with God. He met Rebekah. He is now at Laban's house, and he says, look, before I eat anything, we need to get things straight here. Why I'm here, I'm not even going to eat until I tell you the business. So he tells him the deal that he made with God. And If you go over to verse 49, he says, so now if you're going to deal kindly and truly with my master, tell me. So tell me if this is going to work or not. If not, let me know that I may turn my right foot and go home, basically. So he reveals all this. He reveals what his goal is. He needs to take a wife back to Isaac. And verse 50, then Laban and Bethuel replied, the matter comes from the Lord. We cannot speak to you to this, either good or bad. Here is Rebekah before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. So not even argument here, which again is just pretty amazing to me as this event unfolds. Verse 57, they said, we will call the girl and consult her wishes as well. So they wanted to check with Rebekah to see if she was okay with this situation. Verse 58, they called Rebekah and she and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Again, everything just falling in place as the story unfolds. Verse 59, thus they sent away their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. I want for you to kind of in your mind make note that as Rebekah leaves, when she goes with them, she takes her nurse, and we're going to talk about her in just a moment, along with Abraham's servant and his men. So there's kind of an entourage now that is going to be leaving the hill country and heading back down to Beersheba. Verse 61 of 24, then Rebekah rose with her maids. They mounted the camels, followed the man. So the servant took Rebekah and departed. So this account in chapter 24 of Rebekah heading back to marry Isaac, again, you just see God's hand all over this. It's not something that we could come up with. It's not you can't make this stuff up. It is just so amazing what transpires as this story unfolds for us. Now, a couple other things about Rebekah I want for us to notice. Chapter 24, verse 16, as we are being introduced to Rebekah, says the girl was very beautiful. Now, does that ring a bell? Who else have we already looked at that was very beautiful? Sarah. So, matter of fact, we mentioned a couple weeks ago that, Sarah was so beautiful, even at age 90, Abraham is afraid that he's going to lose his life to Pharaoh because she's so beautiful. They're going to come kill me and steal her. And we get the feeling, as again the story unfolds, that Rebekah has a similar type of beauty. She is just a beautiful woman. And we'll take a look over in 26 verse 7. There's another statement there that she is beautiful. She's very beautiful. And we'll take a look at that here in just a moment as well. But I just want to point out that she is a beautiful woman. We're going to find this, again, it's going to be a common thread throughout the next account as well. In chapter 25 and verse 19, so let's back up just a little bit and kind of pull in some details here. Abraham gives birth to Isaac. And back in chapter 23, Sarah dies. So Isaac is without his mom. And it is at that point that Abraham decides, I need to find a wife for my son. So they get married. And in chapter 25, if you look down, let's start reading verse 19. These are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Amorite, sister of Laban, to be his wife. So Isaac was 40 years old when he finally met up with Rebekah. Verse 21, Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, if you just read those two verses back to back, well, he got married, he was 40 years old, And we don't know how long she was barren. And so I kind of put in parentheses, well, how long was she barren? Was it just a few months? Was it a couple years? Well, look down at chapter 25, verse 26. After his brother came forth in the hand, holding Esau's heel, his name was Jacob, Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. So how long had Rebekah been barren? 19 years or so, right? She was 40 when they got married, 60 when she gives birth. So it wasn't a year or two. There'd been plenty of time that had elapsed here for Isaac and Rebekah to figure out she's barren. Now, again, do you see some similarities here? So who else was barren in our story? Sarah was. And so what happened? Well, there needed to be an intervention there. So we see that history seems to be repeating itself. We'll talk about this some more. It's kind of an interesting theme that runs through here. So Rebekah, just like Sarah, was barren, and God intervenes. Now, one of the other things about Rebekah that she is really just famous for is the deception that takes place between her and her husband. So if you look over at chapter 26, down in verse 7, so let's maybe back up a little bit. Look over at chapter 26 and verse 1. There was a famine in the land beside the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar to Abimelech, king of the Philistines. Now let's go back to the map real quick, because Gerar is not really that far from Beersheba. It's really just kind of across the mountain range, but it would be across the mountain range along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. So the environment over there is going to be more susceptible to rain and those kinds of things as the water comes off the Mediterranean Sea. So during the drought that would have been there in the desert, where it would have been dry and arid anyway, a severe drought happens, so they don't get their 1 or 2 inches of rain that they need to survive. So they go over the mountain range over to Gerar, and that is now where they're headed. So they go to the other side. Abimelech, king of the Philistines, is there. Now, if you look back at Abraham, whenever he and his wife were lying to folks about the sister, one of the guys that they lied to was Abimelech. Well, this is, by the way, a different Abimelech. Abimelech is really more of a title than a name. So obviously the Abimelech that Abraham lied to is probably dead by now. This is probably a new king. But as I mentioned, it's more of a title. He is king of the Philistines. So they have gone into this region. And then if you look down at verse 6, so Isaac lived in Gerar. The men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She is my sister." For he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," thinking the men of the place might kill me on behalf of Rebekah, for she is beautiful. So this is the same lie, the same deception that Abraham and Sarah had done. And here we got Isaac and Rebekah repeating this yet again to another ruler of the Philistines. Of course, then kind of the rest of the story is verse 8. It came about. He had been there a long time. Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out through a window and saw, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife Rebekah. So this is probably a little bit more than him just maybe rubbing her back. The word there seems to indicate that they were probably in an embrace. I mean, it was obvious to the king or whoever saw them that this is a married couple. I mean, it wasn't just a pat on the back. So he sees them, he addresses them. And certainly this is your wife. And then Isaac says, "I was afraid that I might die." Abimelech says, "Why have you done this to us?" He then passes a law, no one is to touch this man or his wife. And then verse 12, Isaac sowed in the land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blesses him. So Isaac continues to be blessed with his wife Rebekah. Now there is another deception that Rebekah is famous for. This one is perhaps more famous than the first one. It's found over in chapter 27, down in verse 5. So in chapter 27, Isaac is getting old. His eyes are getting kind of dim. And Rebekah was listening while Isaac was speaking to the boys. So we got Jacob and Esau that have come out of how God blesses them. They have the twins, Jacob and Esau. And we'll talk more about part of that here in just a moment. And verse 5, Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. Esau went to the field to hunt for game to bring home. So Isaac is going to bless Esau, who was the older of the brothers. He's going to basically give him his blessing. So he said, you go hunt food. Y'all remember the story. Bring me back some good stuff. And Rebekah gets a hold of Jacob and says, behold, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Tells him the story. Then down in verse 10, bring this to your father. So she makes some good game out of a goat. Says, take this to your father that he may eat and that he will bless you before his death. So there is this deception that we have of Rebekah, and she is totally in charge of this deception here. I mean, Jacob participates in it, but it's Rebekah who calls him in and says, by the way, we need to deceive your father so that you get the blessing. And that is indeed what happens. They fool Isaac. His eyesight's left him. He can't see very good. But remember, she puts kind of, I don't know how she glues some kind of fur on his arms. He was totally deceived. Even feels the arms and the hands, and they felt like the brother. They felt like Esau's. Which I don't know how in the world she did that, but she did. It wasn't that she just, in my mind when I was growing up, I had in my mind that she just kind of wrapped his skin around him, and tied it on there. She must have pulled the hair off and glued it to him because Isaac's feeling his hand. So this was a masterful deception. And then sure enough, Isaac gives the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. Now, a couple questions I want to ask about this deception thing that just took place. What good did God bring about in spite of this deception? Now, I do not believe God wanted the deception. I don't believe God wanted the lie. So God acts here in spite of a deception to get over this sin problem that took place. What good does God bring about in spite of this deception that's here? So what happened? Jacob becomes the father of the 12 tribes and the children of Israel. That was the result of this. On the other side of the coin, what evil resulted? Now, the evil perhaps because of Esau's temperament, the evil might have resulted anyway, but what evil resulted? Anybody remember what nation grew out of this? The Edomites. So we have this horrible deception, this horrible lie. And fathers, it's Father's Day. And dads, can you imagine if your wife came and cheated the older brother, the firstborn? I would have been livid. I would have been so mad. What's interesting, we run back into Isaac later. Jacob comes back in there and visits with Dad. Dad doesn't seem to be that upset about it, which I don't quite get that. But because of this deception, we end up with the 12 tribes of Israel, which becomes God's people. And then we end up with the Edomites, which is the whole other extreme. So we end up with these two kind of horrible this situation, this horrible nation and this awesome one. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But another idea about Rebekah. What word or phrase might we use to describe Rebekah? So, can anybody come up with now be nice here, but can you come up with a word or a phrase for Rebecca?
Impatient.
She seems to be extremely impatient, who, by the way, Sarah was rather impatient as well, wasn't she? Seems to be following along. That's a good word, Brian, by the way. What else do we see here about Rebecca? That was one of the words I jotted down. She was very cunning, wasn't she? We used the word deceptive, but it was a little deeper, I think, than deceptive. She had this all figured out. She planned this out and did a fantastic job with it. Conniver, that's a good word. James, were you going to say something?
I was just going to call her a foxy lady.
I
told you not to say words like that. Yes, ma'am.
I feel like she was not trusting. God had said that the younger was going to serve the older, so she knew that was supposed to happen. And instead of just trusting God to take care of that in His way, she kind of took charge of it and did it her way.
And then,
when Sarah did it.
Yeah, it's interesting that repeats itself as well. That there seems to be this idea. I have heard God say some things, and with Sarah, I've heard God say, but it's not happening because I'm barren. We better do my way instead. Now, again, what is interesting, God continues to bring about good in spite of the evil actions of men, which is a good thing for us, right? That's a good lesson for me, because God will bring about good, can bring about good in spite of my evil behavior. God doesn't want the evil behavior, but God can bring about some good things, and we see that with Rebecca. She brought things into her own hands in order to accomplish what perhaps she was thinking was God's will. God, no doubt, had a plan that would not involve sin and deception. Dale.
I was just going to say he wasn't surprised. I mean, he knew this was going to happen.
Yeah.
He had told her that the older should serve the younger.
Yeah.
And he knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. Again, we see, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but again, we see the providence of God unfolding before us, don't we?
Right.
That God can see things and undo things as things kind of come before Him. We've already talked about this, but what similarities and contrasts do we see between Sarah and Rebecca? We've kind of been pointing those out as we've gone through this discussion. I just think it's amazing that history continues to repeat itself, and in some ways a very identical fashion as the stories of these ladies are revealed. And we're not done. We've got one more generation to do this, and you'll see, again, some repetition here, which again is kind of interesting. What lessons can we learn from the stories of these two women between Sarah and Rebecca? One of them we've already talked about. God can bring about good in spite of man's evil, and I think that's a very important lesson for us. Are there some other lessons that you see that we can learn from Rebecca, the stories of Rebecca and Sarah? Yeah, Brian?
Watch out for the pretty girls.
You know, there is a story here about beauty, isn't there? Beauty can be deceptive. And if beauty is the only thing that we go on as men, if that's all that we base our decisions on, we could be going down a very rough road. It could be a very ugly road for us. And again, we're not done with the beauty. The beauty is going to pop back up again, which again I just think is kind of interesting as this unfolds. Any other thoughts here about these two ladies? Yeah, patience and faith, I think, ought to be a very powerful lesson for us. Wait on God. Let God take care of things. And the other thing about what Ron just mentioned is when we think we know better than God does, horrible things on both of these situations with Ishmael and Esau both, evil spins off. Okay? And God is not desiring the evil, but it is part of the spin-off. It's part of our lack of faith and confidence in God. Penny.
I think just as
as you said, history repeating yourself is a good thing to ask yourself what kind of heritage you want to leave for your children.
That's right.
What do you want to be repeated in the next generation that your kids learn?
That's right. Yeah, this idea of history repeating itself, we need to make sure that we are doing our best to make sure that it is good history that repeats itself and not evil. And I think that's a great point. It's a great lesson for us about what kind of parents and what kind of influence that we need to have in our world today. So there's kind of the account of Rebekah. I want to talk about a woman by the name of Deborah who's associated here. We were actually introduced to her back in Genesis chapter 24, and I just ask you to kind of make a note there as we read through. In verse 58, it is not verse 58 of chapter 24. It is? Oh yeah, well it's actually verse 59, isn't it? So verse 58, they called Rebekah and said, will you go with this man? She said, I will go. Verse 59, thus they sent their sister Rebekah and her nurse with Abraham's servant and his men. Now if you go over to chapter 35. Chapter 35 and verse 8. So this is later on down in the story. But in 35:8, we run into this verse. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, and that's who we were introduced to back in Genesis 24, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the oak, and it was named Allon Bachuth, which means the oak of weeping. Now the reason I wanted to point Deborah out is because there's some interesting things that we can learn from this. First of all, this idea of a nurse, especially as we place it back into the Old Testament context, this was not a physician nurse. Okay, this was a nursing nurse. Okay, so she took care of the children and probably nursed them. So that's the concept here. She was the one that would have taken care and probably held close the children. So that's what is significant about this term nurse. It wasn't that she was a doctor. She was playing a role that was extremely important for the children. What does the name of the oak tree tell us about the relationship between Rebekah and Deborah? So when she dies, they place her under the oak, and it's called the oak of weeping. What does that mean about their relationship? What do we learn? They are extremely close to one another. They are best friends. As a matter of fact, they've been together this whole time. They were probably together. It was probably, Dad probably gave the nurse to her before they ever left. Perhaps even as a young person growing up, here is who is going to be with you for the rest of your life. So the relationship between Rebekah and Deborah were extremely close. What is significant about her name being recorded for us? Now, if you think about her as a nursemaid, is there another word that we might use to describe a nursemaid, especially in the context of the book of Genesis? What else might we call her? We might call her a slave, a servant. So she was kind of the lowly of the lowlies. So probably had no choice in this matter. What is significant about God recording her name for us? Does God care? Does God care whether she was a slave or a servant? No. She is one of His children, and I believe God elevates her to a position where we know her name because of her commitment and her love for one of God's women. I just think it's beautiful. What does this tell us about God's view of her? God has elevated her to such an extent that we know her name. So I mentioned before that I don't believe God gives us names of these ladies just by accident. I think it's for a purpose, for us to learn something about. And you know, in our world of, especially now, all this stuff about racism and how ugly our world has become, this is a powerful lesson for us. God doesn't see people this way. God sees us as His people, and He wants to elevate us, and just as He did with Deborah here. So kind of a beautiful story here. All right, I want to take a look at two more of these ladies that are sort of associated with Abraham, but now associated with Isaac, and that is Rachel and Leah. So if you would, turn back to Genesis chapter 29. I want to do a similar thing with Rachel and Leah as we did with Rebekah. I want to kind of go through Genesis chapter 9 real quick and just capture some of the highlights here. So we talked about Isaac and Rebekah. They had the twins, Jacob and Esau. And now it is time for Jacob to also get a wife. Okay? So at this point in the ball game, Jacob and Esau are not on real good terms. So the conflict is already starting. So in verse 4 of chapter 29, Jacob says, "My brothers, where are you going?" So Jacob has, we'll go back to chapter 29, verse 1. Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the sons of the east. He looked and he saw a well in the field, and behold, the 3 flocks of sheep were lying there beside it, from where they watered the flocks. Now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, they would roll the stone from the mouth of the well, water the sheep, put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. So Jacob has gone back to the home country again. He's looking, his turn to look for a wife. He gets there to the well and has a conversation at the well. "My brothers, where are you from?" And they said, "We are from Haran." So again, that's the very north region that we talked about on the map. So that's where they're from. He said, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" And they said, "We know him." And he said to them, "Is it well with him?" And they said, "Yes, it is well. And as a matter of fact, here's Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep." So already when we're introduced to this, we see a very similar thing unfold as happened with sorry about that, as happened with Isaac and Rebekah. So they're at the well. Rachel shows up. Jacob ends up watering the sheep down in verse 9. While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the mouth of the well, watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted his voice and wept. So really, as soon as Jacob meets Rachel, he just automatically knows this is her. This is the woman I need to marry. Now, when it talks about him kissing her, this was probably more of a greeting. I doubt that he grabbed her and, dipped her down and gave her a big smooch like we might picture in our minds. This was a greeting. So Jacob greets her and realizes that this again is amazing. I have come to the well. I have met the woman that's going to be my wife. Jacob, verse 12, Jacob told Rachel that he was a relative of her father, that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. So a very similar event is unfolding before us as has happened with the previous generation. Again, it's kind of interesting that this unfolds in this way. Now, I think I want to put a peg down right there in verse 12. Let's stop right there and pick up next week with the rest of the story of Rachel and Leah. And we're also going to pick up 2 other ladies that are in this narrative, and that's Bildad and Zilpah. So if you don't remember them, you might read through the rest of chapter 29 and following, and we'll talk about these 4 ladies and the role that they play as this account unfolds for us. So let's end right there. If you would, join me in a word of prayer, and we'll close for the morning. God, thank you so much for your word, and thank you for the lessons that we can learn. Father, we are thankful for these great ladies that the stories that you have provided for us. And God, help us to learn these lessons. Help us to adjust our lives to be the way that you want them to be. God, we love you and thank you for this day that we can meet together. It's through your Son we pray. Amen.